If you've ever watched anime, you've probably seen these bugs before. Maybe they're more familiar to you as a robot, as a monster, or as the motif on a superhero's helmet. But what are they? And why is Japanese media so obsessed with them? To find out, I examined Japanese blogs, a manga about the creator of Pokemon, and the Evangelion series Bible. And in this video, I'll show you what I learned. As a kid, I saw beetle motifs all over TV shows like Metabots and Power Rangers, but I don't remember knowing what the shapes were referencing. What I do remember is asking my mom for a Metabee figure from the dollar store, and years later in an Old Navy, begging her for the dark blue ranger from Power Rangers Ninja Storm. Growing up with anime and other localized media, so much contextless Japanese culture influenced my childhood. But in adulthood, I've been surrounded by the context. And as I became fluent in Japanese and started watching more untranslated shows, I started noticing these bugs everywhere. In English, they're called rhinoceros and stag beetles. But in Japanese, both of their names come from their resemblance to samurai helmets. The rhinoceros beetle is called kabutomushi, or helmet bug, and the stag beetle is called kuwagatamushi, named after the decorations that its pincers resemble. For the rest of the video, I'm going to call them by these names, because that will help us unlock the mystery of how they ended up all over anime. And the bugs have other Japanese names too. In the case of kabuto, its name is actually a regional term that was used in Kyoto before becoming the national standard. But back in the Edo period, the kabuto was also called loquat bug, horn bug, and demon beetle. The term demon beetle is sometimes still used. It can actually refer to kabuto or kuwagata, since Japanese demons come in both two- and one-horned varieties. And out of all the regional names, demon beetle is probably the most important one. You'll see why in a minute. But first, we have to talk about Pokemon. You see, when I was a college student in Tokyo, I lived in a suburb called Matsudo. In my first days there, I recognized a lot of things that, beforehand, had only been normal to me in anime and video games. The above-ground power lines, so often featured in moments of melancholy in anime, were common in the suburbs. And the tall grass from Pokemon represented a real species of grass that was ubiquitous by the riverside where I spent my afternoons. But the most surprising sight was when I saw a little boy exploring a patch of grass with his dad, and dressed like a bug catcher from Pokemon. He wore the iconic outfit, shorts, sandals, a t-shirt, and a straw hat. And in his hands was the unmistakable tool of a bug catcher, the butterfly net. Of course, I knew what all these things were outside of the context of Pokemon and before I got to Japan. But this specific combination of them constituted a uniform, one that gave Pokemon's bug catchers their distinct look. So sitting by that riverside, with the bike path behind me and the tall grass nearby, I felt a sense of nostalgia, even though it was only my first time there. For me, that experience really drove home just how much design in foreign media I grew up with was inspired by elements of daily life that were alien to me, but normal to the artists who drew inspiration from them. And recently, it became crystal clear to me that bug catchers are more than just an inspiration for Pokemon. A bug catcher created Pokemon. While researching for this episode, I read a manga biography of Satoshi Tajiri. When Satoshi was a kid, the town he lived in had woods nearby, and whenever he got the chance, Satoshi would play in those woods and hunt for insects. Of all the bugs, his favorite was the kuwagata, and when he wasn't in the woods, he would spend his free time reading encyclopedias, trying to understand them better. Satoshi wanted to get good at catching kuwagata, and when he achieved that goal, he started focusing on learning to take care of them. But when Satoshi was in middle school, the woods by his house were cut down, and the river where he used to catch frogs was destroyed. Not long after, in 1979, Space Invaders came out in arcades, and Satoshi became obsessed with video games. His name became a regular at the top of local scoreboards, and in his late teens, he started a newsletter to share tips. The newsletter was called Game Freak, and one of its fans was a young artist named Ken Sugimori. Ken sent letters to Satoshi, and they became friends. And a few years later, they started making video games together, and they named the company Game Freak, after Satoshi's newsletter that had brought them together. Ken was Satoshi's main character designer, and he's the man responsible for the classic watercolor art of the Gen 1 Pokemon. But the mechanics of Pokemon go all the way back to Satoshi's childhood with the Kuwagata in the forest, collecting them, breeding them, and studying their encyclopedia entries. When looking at Pokemon's origins, I can't help but feel that the series comes out of a sense of mourning. Satoshi's mourning for the woods and river by his childhood home that were cut down and filled in. With Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri has inspired generations of children and adults to go on adventures with odd creatures who metamorphosize. But in that way, Pokemon is a simulation of something that used to be easier to do in real life. But across the Pacific, 4 decades later, my childhood summers were a lot different. And I spent a lot of my time fighting robot versions of the Beatles on my Game Boy Advance. Starting with the first game in the franchise, the robot fighting series Metabots borrowed Pokemon's 2-version gimmick, and putting Kabuto and Kuwagata-inspired robots on the covers provided an organic way to do so. In fact, the versions were literally called Kuwagata and Kabuto. And that's part of the fun of the bugs, choosing your favorite and engaging in the rivalry. It's worked for Metabots. The series has kept its Beetle branding throughout its nearly 30-year history. And now, it has dozens of robots inspired by the bugs. And it's not alone. Kuwagata and Kabuto have inspired robots in Super Sentai, Time Bokan, and Transformers. And they're at the center of Big Bad Beetleborgs. You might be wondering, though, what do beetles have to do with robots? Well, one blog I read mentioned the bugs' exoskeletons. The blog was written by an otaku named Kago Hitsuji, who spent much of their childhood in China before moving back to Japan. And Kago Hitsuji references their own experiences to try to sympathize with how Japanese kids feel about Kabuto. They wrote that, as a kid in Beijing, they would collect scarab beetles, and the shine of the bug's shells reminded them of a suit of armor. And that made me remember my own childhood in the southwestern United States. Where I grew up, we used to play with roly-polies, which are scientifically called armadillidae. Notice how armor is right there in the name. Exoskeletons in general can be a metaphor for armor. And one song from 1999 uses Kabuto as a metaphor for vulnerability. The Kabuto's resemblance to armor is part of what connects them to robots. In the blog post I mentioned earlier, Kago Hitsuji noted that Kabuto remind them of Gundam, and I immediately understood why. Because in the late 70s, Kunio Okawara designed Gundam with influences from samurai armor. And since both Kabuto and Kuwagata got their names because of their resemblance to samurai armor, it naturally follows that they also resemble things based off of it. Other sources mention that widespread interest in beetles began around the 60s and 70s, and some theorized that insects in general became more popular because of their resemblance to movie monsters like Mothra. But for Kuwagata and Kabuto specifically, the fact that they look like the robots that showed up on TV during and after the 1980s anime boom is an underappreciated factor in their sustained popularity. And if you like anime and other pop culture, you should check out Entertainment Earth. Entertainment Earth has tons of cool Evangelion figures like this one, and Transformers pieces too, like this G.I. Joe crossover Soundwave, and Frankenstein's monster is a Decepticon. While writing this video, I also found this drop-dead gorgeous Wolverine Funko Pop. They've got tons of other goodies too, so check out the affiliate link in the video description. And anything you buy using that link helps me to have time to produce videos for this channel. In the 1992 manga Barcode Fighters, there's a Kabuto-inspired robot called Dash Beetle. And when I first saw Dash Beetle, I had a realization about a mecha anime that came out 3 years later in 1995. Because the shape of Dash Beetle's head looks a lot like Unit 1 from Evangelion. After noticing that, I was sure that Unit 1's design was patterned after Kabuto, but I wanted to show you proof. So I searched in both English and Japanese for references to the bug in the context of the show. The first thing I found was this article from Famitsu talking about how model manufacturer Fujimi added Units 1 and 2 to their series of anime-themed Beetle toys. And a Yahoo Answers Japan post from 2018 also compared Unit 1 to Kabuto. These examples show that some people recognize parallels between Evangelion's main mecha and the Kabuto, but they weren't official sources. So for that, I decided to search for the show's series Bible, and I found scans of it tucked away in a 1998 Laserdisc box set. That night, while the rest of my family slept, I stayed up late, reading through the document and taking notes, until I came to an additional page that included scans of even older material. It was the first sketch of Unit 1, drawn by director Hideaki Anno and faxed to character designer Ikuto Yamashita. The sketch included handwritten notes from Anno, highlighting things for Yamashita to keep in mind as he took Anno's concepts and turned them into designs. And at the top of the page, in large writing, Anno wrote a guiding principle for how Unit 1's appearance should feel. It read simply, like a demon. I have to admit, I was disappointed. I had spent hours searching to find the connection between Evangelion's Unit 1 and Kabuto, but Anno's notes clearly showed it was patterned after demons. Then I remembered something that I told you earlier in this video. The Kabuto is also called the Demon Bug, and the images in the series Bible were not the rough sketches depicting Anno's initial ideas, they were Yamashita's refined designs. Page 35 shows two designs for Unit 1. A single-horned version that closely resembles what appeared in the anime, and an alternate two-horned version. Remember that the one-horned Kabuto and the two-pincered Kuwagata are both referred to as demon beetles. So it's possible that Yamashita read Anno's demon note and interpreted it through the lens of demon beetles. In fact, another page shows a double-horned design imagined for Unit 2, and though they weren't present in its earliest appearances in the anime, horns were added when the rebuild of Evangelion film series began. And if we look at Fujimi's Mabu Kuwagata, we can see that Unit 2's horns are what lent their color to the toy's pincers. The circumstantial evidence is certainly there, but in regard to this video's question, it actually doesn't matter whether the units were intentionally modeled after demon beetles. Evangelion's mecha look the way they do because they're inspired by demons, but they might also look that way because of the influence of prior mecha that were patterned after samurai. Kuwagata and Kabuto look like both, and that makes them cool by association. Even though our sources didn't give a uniform answer for why Japan loves these beetles, I get it now. And part of the reason lies in how the bugs have inspired games like Pokemon, because the greatest strength of Pokemon is that it can be played multiple ways. You can focus on catching them, caring for them, researching them, or battling them. And there's so many other playstyles that let anyone enjoy their beauty. Kabuto and Kuwagata are samurai, but they're also giant monsters, and robots, and demons, and summer vacations, and nostalgia. Just like Pokemon, they mean so much, but they aren't the same thing to everybody. Oh, and by the way, Gundam wasn't the only robot Kunio Okawada designed, but you can learn more about that by clicking this tape.